It's the summer of 991 and two armies face each other across a narrow causeway, the clash of their swords and battle axes echoing down through history from near a place called Maldon. Some 16 years before, the young kingdom of England suffered the premature death of its king, Edgar the Peaceful, at age just 32. Edgar was so named for the period of relative stability and peace from Viking attacks that had begun all the way back in 793 with the infamous and initial raid at Lindisfarne. The last Viking king in England, Eric Bloodaxe, had been driven out decades before, and the heyday of conquest, when the great heathen army under the iconic sons of Ragnar Lothbrok terrorised the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the middle 9th century, were long over. It had taken multiple generations from Alfred the Great's victory over Guthrum in 878, but eventually the unified Anglo-Saxon England that Edgar eventually ruled coalesced under his predecessor Aethelstan in 927, who had himself won a famous, if hard-fought, victory over a coalition of monarchs, including a Viking king in 937 at the Battle of Brandenburg. But if Edgar's reign had overseen a period of relative calm, his own successors would oversee a bloody period of decline, ultimately leading to what would have been unthinkable to the likes of Alfred or his son Edward the Elder and Aethelstan, his grandson, the full Danish conquest of the Anglo-Saxons and the dispossession of the native house of Wessex. King Edgar had married multiple times. His third and final wife, Elfrith, had borne him a son, Ethelred, though Edgar's elder son, Edward, was sired from an earlier wife. Naturally, Elfrith was keen for her own son, Ethelred, to succeed her husband. However, Edward's age and support favoured his election to the throne. Unfortunately for Edward, he was still a teenager at the time of his accession, and thus unable to fully take on the reins of power. This, as well as Elfrith's status as Edgar's widow, proved crucial given its split support amongst the nobles and great men of the kingdom. Complicating matters, and perhaps inflaming tempers, was the possibility that Edward was in fact illegitimate, which, if true, would have indeed emphasised Ethelred's superior atheling or throne-worthy status over Edward, regardless of his younger age. Elfrith herself was also not some passive observer to events, and likely played a significant political role behind the scenes. Wedding Edgar in 964, she was the daughter of Ordgar, Ealdorman of Devon, and widow of Ethelwald, Ealdorman of East Anglia. Ambitious to have her son crowned, it was also not too hard to turn certain important men against her stepson. Edward's hold on power may have been undermined by his own fiery conduct, the teenaged atheling turned king being temperamental and even prone to violent outbursts that alienated many, at least according to one source. Despite these disadvantages, Edward was crowned at Kingston upon Thames before the end of 975, enjoying the support of both archbishops, Dunstan and Oswald, the archbishops of Canterbury and York respectively, as well as Ethelwine, the Ealdorman of East Anglia, and Byrhtnoth, Ealdorman of Essex. Opposed to this Edwardian faction was Elfrith, of course, as well as Elfhere, Ealdorman of Mercia, and Ethelwald, Bishop of Winchester. Added into this toxic brew was a general opportunism of some of the powerful men at court, taking back lands they had lost under the reign of Edward's father. Though on the surface a pious act on Edgar's part, the increasing of church landholdings at the expense of secular powers was guaranteed to stoke resentment, and then such disunity and opportunism during a minority period. Elfhere was a particularly potent advocate of the anti-monastic movement. While the situation is more nuanced than a black and white pro-church and anti-church opposition, Edward's noble supporters also seized back lands from church and monastic estates, for example. Dunstan's backing of Edward ensured his association with his father's unpopular policy. The young Edward's reign, in a way, foreshadowed that of his half-brothers, the rival factions unable to come together, with political intrigue and division rife, and even the threat of civil war itself looming large over the kingdom. As to the matter of the succession, this was decided conclusively and bloodily on the 18th of March 978. The later Corfe Castle was originally built by William the Conqueror himself and is located in Dorset, though it served before this as an important location for the Anglo-Saxons too. It was here on that March day that Edward met Ælfrith, along with other senior men and his own council. Arriving at the gates, he was infamously offered a cup of mead, possibly by Ælfrith herself, which provided the distraction and the cue for an attendant to stab the king from behind. The resultant likely commotion caused Edward's horse to bolt from under him, causing the dying young king to be dragged off as he bled out. If this shocking and bloody beginning to Ethelred's reign was less than ideal, it certainly mirrored the internal and external struggles to come. For all this king's huge failings, this is one act he surely had no part in, though it's speculated that Ælfrith herself plotted the murder, or at least allowed it, and left Edward's murderers unpunished. Ælfhere is another obvious suspect, given his strong opposition to the monastic faction and his open support for Ethelred. Indeed, since Ælfhere may also have seen Edward's approaching maturity into full manhood as a threat to his and his allies' gains in taking back church and monastic lands, he did arrange for Edward's body to be reinterred from Wareham to Shaftesbury Abbey around a year after the murder, which is somewhat suspicious. Of course, we'll never really know. A larger threat loomed over the kingdom in the coming years, an old enemy whose attacks had lessened during the golden age of Edgar's reign. By 991, Danish raids had become more frequent, with the young king unable to stem the violence. In the summer of 991, a large fleet of dragon-headed longboats appeared off the Suffolk coast, having already ravaged Folkstone in Kent. Its destination was Ipswich, a bustling trading port that was also viciously sacked. The fleet of around 100 ships, carrying a horde of about 4,000 men, then worked its way down the Essex coast to the Blackwater estuary. It was here on Northey Island that the raiders paused, with their next target being the busy and prosperous town of Maldon. Their leader, a certain captain by the name of Olaf, possibly Olaf Tryggvason, the future King of Norway, may have been shocked to learn that an English host was waiting for them nearby on the mainland, and were far from cowed. Byrhtnoth, Ealdorman of Essex, and former supporter of the martyr, had assembled his own household of warriors, which were complemented by feardmen, that is, local militias called out in times of emergency to defend their lands. In all, Byrhtnoth mustered around 3,000 men, but this ealdorman was certainly no pampered Anglo-Saxon aristocrat. The white-haired Byrhtnoth, though around 60 years old, was literally a towering presence that day, at over 6 feet in height, and had holdings in 10 shires, making him, after King Ethelred himself, the second or third most important layman in England. A man and lord, certainly with the power and gravitas to back his strong sword arm. Olaf, however, had not got the news, as he wrongly assumed a spineless leader, and brazenly demanded tribute from the stony-faced East Saxon host. The Viking position was strong from a defensive standpoint. However, Olaf's men were not here to settle. As with earlier attacks, Viking raids were just that, an excuse for easy money at little loss. Olaf's host was certainly not in the business of conquest, and despite romantic modern notions, would have preferred to avoid battle if possible, ferrying their loot back home at minimal loss of life and limb. Byrhtnoth, for his part, had the home advantage and was equally in no rush to confront Olaf's raiders, but confront them he would. There would be no tribute paid that day. The island on which the Norse camped was connected in low tide to the mainland by a small land bridge, but it would be impossible for Olaf to bring his slightly larger numbers to bear on his English foes. And so it proved. The Norse rushed across as the tide ebbed, but Byrhtnoth checked this by sending in his own retinue of elite troops to hold them. The initial attack was indeed beaten back, with Olaf hastily ordering retreat back to Northey to avoid any further unnecessary losses. The initial victory clearly boosted East Saxon morale, given subsequent events. It was at this point that any modern observer may assume that the Viking leader cut his losses, boarded his longboats, and selected another, viable, less well-defended target. Why risk Norse lives, funneling his warriors down a narrow causeway to just break on the shields of the angry and now emboldened local defenders? Well, amazingly, he didn't need to. Olaf got around this problem by again brazenly shouting a challenge across to Byrhtnoth, that he should allow him and his men safe passage across the causeway to decide the contest on equal ground like men. Unbelievably, this is exactly what happened. Whether it was bravado or perhaps a calculated decision on the East Saxon leader's part to allow the crossing so as to destroy the raiders once and for all before they could do any more damage elsewhere, will never truly be known. Whatever the case, Olaf and his troops eagerly streamed across the land bridge, screaming their battle cries. It was then that the two forces clashed in the traditional manner, two great shield walls crashing and splintering against one another, each man attempting to hack an opening that could be exploited and widened to break the enemy. Perhaps shockingly to Olaf, Byrhtnoth's mostly feared militia held their own, and more than posed a tricky challenge to the axes and blades of the Norse contingent, killing many where they stood. Yet despite this valiant effort, the decisive moment came when the East Saxon commander himself was fatally wounded while masterfully wielding his golden-hilted sword. As Byrhtnoth sunk beneath the shields of his host, his companions Ealdorman and Wolfmire also fell loyally at the side of their lord. Another man, Godric, however, who had also received Byrhtnoth's gifts and favours, took this opportunity to shamefully flee on his own lord's horse, sealing his fate to death and legend. Many men who knew the horse erroneously assumed that Byrhtnoth himself had fled, and panic began to crumble the East Saxon shield wall. Yet even then hope remained. A simple fierdsman known as Dunir remarkably managed to rally a significant number around him to fight on. However, defeat was by then inevitable, as chinks began to be exploited by the Norse host. In a last stand, a certain Edward the Tall, another loyal retainer of Byrhtnoth, broke out of his own shield wall to hack desperately at his foes, in an attempt to avenge his fallen lord, but was, in his turn, cut down. The battle then was savage, and losses were heavy enough on both sides that Olaf, despite breaking the English lines, withdrew from his attack on Maldon itself, which was perhaps a small consolation for the local men whose blood had reddened the earth that day. But this setback for Olaf was only a temporary respite overall, with Viking raids continuing in later months. The raiders later defeated a fleet sent from East Anglia, and the only solution was to buy them off. It was Sigeric, Archbishop of Canterbury, who suggested the payment of a tax to the Danes that would become infamously known as the Danegeld. Indeed, in 994, the same archbishop paid such a tribute to the Danes to avoid the burning of his cathedral. The price of temporary peace for the kingdom grew ever taller, with the tribute following Maldon amounting to £10,000. However, such appeasement only ultimately exacerbated the problem, with ever-increasing raids eventually giving way to full-blown conquest in the persons of Sweyn Forkbeard in 1013, and then his son Canute the Great, who finally subdued Ethelred's kingdom in 1016, following several hard-fought battles and the death of Ethelred's son and successor, King Edmund Ironside.